when Kiran wanted to say that the conflict in Syria is something that has been raging for a very long time, what he forgot to mention was that conflict wasn't leading to hundreds of thousands of people dying.
Yeah.
That tension has been running for a long time, but there was a very important and delicate balance of power in Syria that stopped people from dying. And while we think that while ethnic tensions are something that are never desirable within a country, if it takes a dictatorship that doesn't allow free elections to stop people from murdering their neighbours within their cities, that's a sacrifice we were willing to make to protect people's lives and preserve the ability to get better resolution of those tensions in the long run. So first of all, in rebuttal, I want to deal with some of Kiran's material about democracy. Before I move on to two really important points. First of all, I want to talk about the rights and the protection of minority groups within the countries that have been touched by the Arab Spring. And second of all, I want to talk about what has been the effect on the economies of these countries. First of all, Kiran wanted to tell us that it was really important that we foster a culture of democracy within those countries, which would have been an excellent argument if there was a genuine culture of democracy that had arisen as a result of the Arab Spring. My response to that, first of all, there previously wasn't a culture of democracy within Egypt, Tunisia, or any of those countries. They had a culture of sham elections. Their experiences of democracy were perverted and corrupted to the point where many people within those countries don't see democracy as the best system of government. Second of all, we would say that even now, as a result of the Arab Spring, there was incredibly divided opinion on what the alternative solution would be. No thank you. Like Elle offered a point of information and wanted to say, look, you saw widespread no thank you protests in support of democracy. That means that the populace within these countries must want democracy. In the case of Egypt, let's look very specifically. One, no, the level of protesting was incredibly large within Cairo, but we would say that there's a great disparity between things like the rural and the metropolitan areas of all these countries in terms of progressiveness and ideals about whether or not democracy is a desirable system of government. Second of all, in the case of Egypt, the protests were not for democracy. They were against Mubarak, and there were a lot of political groups with a lot of different desires about how they saw the alternative playing out, and certainly in most cases wasn't a democracy that liberal reformers would necessarily like to envision. No, thank you. But second of all, we would say, even if there was widespread support for democracy, in practice, we can observe that their desires have not played out, and that has not been the result. And we want to look at what is actually happening in people's lives, and not what we would like to envision for the future. What else did he hear from Kiran? Kiran wanted to say that the West shouldn't be backing dictators. We would say, we agree, the West probably might not have a lot of prop dictators here, but that doesn't mean we should therefore celebrate when the top-level dictators result in a much greater slaughter of individuals and a much greater loss of life, and ultimately harms to further reforms in the future, so to that extent, we think that it was okay. No, thank you, I will take you later though. You wanted to ask us, how do you get genuine opposition when you're under a dictatorship? Like, you can never get genuine opposition, so you can never get genuine democracy. We would have a couple of responses to that. First of all, we don't think that genuine opposition is being fostered within places like Egypt right now. Like, groups that have the existing power structures, that have the weapons, that have the ability to influence, like the Muslim Brotherhood, are doing their best to oppress any other competition within that electoral system. So to that extent, we didn't buy that was necessarily occurring now. But furthermore, what we would say is a premature uprising in a situation like the Arab Spring fractures the opposition into fighting with each other, right? Like, we think it's really important that the opposition be united, and that is something we have not observed, because those countries have not reached a consensus on what the best system of government was. There was not a consensus on what the best alternative to stopping that dictator was, so to that extent, we don't think that is good enough. Yeah, I'll take it.
So, in Egypt, when Mubarak was in power for 30 years, when would it have not been premature for an uprising against him?
Well, for starters, we think, we've already told you we think people are worse off now than they were before. So we're not just saying that we're happy with the current situation, so we think there would have been more effective future. We would say, even if you just, in the short term, say, how good is it being an Egyptian today versus 3 years ago? No, thank you. We would say that there has been a net loss. So we don't have to prove that necessarily there was going to be a perfect intervention in the future. We would say, Tom gave you a lot of the reasons within his speech why you undermine the course of further reform in the future, and I don't really have time to go through them now. Okay, so the first argument I want to bring you, minority religious rights within these groups. We've already told you that there's a very delicate balance of power. No, thank you. I will take a closing later, though. There's a very delicate balance of power within these countries. There is a lot of ethnic diversity within these countries, which is why pointing to the example of the Soviet Union just wasn't really going to play here in terms of the ability for sustainable reform. While across the Soviet Union there are lots of different minority groups and lots of different beliefs, they were tended to be cloistered within different regions. So when the Soviet Union was broken up, they were broken up into countries within those regions. So no, thank you. What we would say is, in the case of most of these countries, like Syria is a really good example, you have a lot of minority groups with a lot of tensions and a lot of existing problems that are going to flare up when you get rid of that balance of power. We think that the governments were really good about managing that balance of power, no thank you. And they did it in a really, in a way that might not be the most desirable way, but a way that works. So that meant often favouring certain religious groups and creating different ethnic trade-offs that, quite frankly, some people might not be necessarily happy with, but ultimately prevented outbreaks of violence. We think that that's really important, even if it might not be the best for equality, but ultimately preventing further violence. Go ahead.
We can accept that the Arab Spring may have increased violence in the short term. The debate isn't just about that time. Can you actually deal with why repressive dictatorships in perpetuum are better than movements towards democracy?
Absolutely, yeah. First of all, let's just talk about those short-term harms briefly. What has been the immediate result? We've seen these ethnic groups getting slaughtered, right? But in the long run, what are the kinds of incentives you create? So let's look at the Alawites in Syria. They are a very small minority, about 12% of the population, but they are 70% of the military. Into the future, they have absolutely no reason to broker a peace deal at the moment under the current situation in Syria, because they know that that's going to lead to reprisals, which will ultimately lead to the deaths of them and their children. So into the future, they have no desire to reform or actually fix that situation. They're going to continue killing other people in an effort to self-preserve. But we've seen attacks on Coptics in Egypt, both in the short term terms, like attacks on Coptic churches and Coptic communities. But into the future, those are the groups that are going to be disenfranchised, where you have groups like the Muslim Brotherhood taking control and installing Islamist ideals. We would also say in the case of women, it's probably a pretty good example, because the growth of Islamism in a lot of these countries as a result of the Arab Spring is going to set women's rights in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, back about 400 years, because you have lots of money and funding coming in from countries like Saudi Arabia to back Islamist forces within those countries. Very briefly, let's talk about economies. Kiran tells these dictators are really bad for the economy. We can see empirically that that has not played out. Poverty is skyrocketing in places like Egypt and Syria, because they just can't get any industries to work. Why? First of all, places like Egypt, where tourism was the second biggest part of their economy, the instability directly lost that. The loss of things like infrastructure, the exploitation of commodities like oil has lost them a lot of money. The argument from them might be that under a dictator, the wealth doesn't reach the people. But we know that that doesn't play out in the real world, because we've seen rising unemployment, we've seen rising poverty and drops in standard of living empirically playing out. So clearly some of the wealth was trickling down. I hate to use the term, but you see what I'm getting at. It's really important that you have that economic development. When you have this kind of instability and you destroy infrastructure, people starve to death and lose the ability to access healthcare. Right to vote in elections is far less useful if you cannot put food on the table. Democracy is a secondary right to the ability to feed your family, and for all those reasons, we're very proud to close the